Hello, and welcome to another Georgia Department of Education Professional Learning Community webinar. My name is Patrick Collins, and today we're going to be talking about marching arts audio. I wanted to talk about this for a couple reasons. One, I figure a lot of you are either former band directors or have a music tech class in addition to your band duties, just because that's kind of how a lot of us get started in this. But also for some of you that maybe don't have that experience but have always been interested and want to find a way to get involved at your school. So this is going to kind of give a overview of kind of what all goes into a marching arts audio system, and then kind of some ways to organize it is really kind of the basic setup here, and we'll dig into a little bit of settings as well. So what we're going to look at first is designing a system, and this is great for if you're looking to upgrade your current system, or you're looking to just like completely overhaul your system, or even just build from the ground up. So the first question you're going to want to ask yourself when you start planning to either design a new system or overhaul an old system is, what do you need right now? And this is purely from a numbers perspective of students, but also what kind of equipment do you use? If you are at a school that always uses a drum set and always uses a guitarist for your front ensemble, then your needs are going to be different than somebody who only uses mallet instruments or maybe has 3 or 4 synthesizers, or like a school around us that uses mallet stations for all of their mallet instruments. Your needs are going to be different. So you want to plan for that now based on what you currently need. Then you want to start looking at, what do you want? And that's, what do you want in the future out of your electronics setup? The reason to think about this is, often with electronics, it can be cheaper to go ahead and overbuy a little bit or buy for the future than it is to buy for now and then replace it later. And it can be like pretty substantially cheaper to do that. So you want to think about what your needs are in the future, because it may be only $200, $500 extra to go ahead and future proof your system than it would be to buy the cheaper one now and then replace later. And the extra layer of this is, what will your needs be in the future because of growth or because of how you change show design? So right now, if you're at a large school but your ensemble is really small, you may be thinking, okay, there's an issue with recruitment and retention, but we're going to solve that. We're working on that, and the group will grow eventually. So if you only plan for 2 marimbas, but you know in the future it's going to be 4, you want to make sure you have planned for that in the future. Conversely, if you are a small school and you already have a relatively small ensemble, but it's a good size relative to your school, you may not need to try to future proof it as much. So it's kind of keeping those things in mind to save yourself money in the long run. The other part of that is, what kind of competitive group are you? If you're going to try to compete BOA Grand Nats, things like that, or you're doing indoor drumline, things like that, then your needs are going to be different than somebody that is just trying to amplify a Friday night home game, right? So it's thinking about that and planning, like, what kind of tools do I need, and looking at those groups. I cannot recommend enough. Like, tons of drum corps will have their audio systems online. Like Bluecoats, you can see walkthroughs of their whole system. I think Crown, you can as well, Carolina Crown. But also other schools you can look at and just like find videos, see what they have, email people, ask. One of the easiest things to do is figure out what the people that you strive to be are using, and then design your system around that. So your biggest expense is going to be your mixer, which we'll talk more about in a second. But when you're planning for that mixer, the thing to keep in mind is how many channels you're going to need. The more channels you need, the more expensive it's going to be. A way that you can kind of plan this out in advance is using kind of like just planning how many channels it's going to be. So for vibraphones, soloists, and guitarists, it's common to use 1 channel per. So like a soloist, that's a single mic. You plug it in, that's 1 channel. Guitarist, you're going to run it into a direct box. That's going to be 1 channel. Vibraphone, also 1 mic. So if you had 2 vibraphones, 2 soloists, and a guitarist, you would need at least 5 channels. For marimbas and synthesizers, you generally need 2 channels. Synthesizers is for left and right, so stereo audio. And then for marimbas, the keyboard's so wide that you need 2 mics to be able to pick up the full spectrum. Vibraphone, you will see 2 mics used relatively often as well. That's actually what we use, is 2 on our vibraphone, but you can potentially save channels if you need to by only doing 1 per vibraphone. And then drum set and timpani, you can do a minimum of 2, right? So 2 overhead mics just kind of picking up the whole drum set acoustically. But if you wanted to like mic each individual drum, you're expanding out on your channels, right? So you need a kick drum, a snare drum, 3 toms, and then 2 overheads. So that's getting you to 7 channels that you need just for your drums. And same thing with the timpani. So planning out in advance is going to make the biggest impact. So when you're designing your system, the first thing you're probably going to look at is the mixer, because remember, we planned out what all we need. So when we look at the mixer, the first thing you're going to look at is the number of channels, because if you have 20 channels, you know that you need more than 16, right? So when you're looking for them, that's what you're going to purchase. The most common are going to be 8, 16, and 32. There are some 24 channel mixers as well, but you want to kind of plan for that. So if you're somebody that needs 25 channels, you either need to lose a channel somehow, or you're going to have to go all the way up to 32, because I'm trying to think, I don't really know of any off the top of my head that have between 24 and 32. So you would have to spend the money to get 32. The advantage of that is you have some space if you ever need to expand later. Something else you can look at on a mixer is whether it's expandable or not. A lot of digital mixers you will be able to attach stage boxes to, which can add extra channels. So if you had a 16 channel mixer, you could plug in a 16 channel stage box, and then now you're at a 32 channel mixer. So that could be a good option if you're trying to save a little bit of money now and then want to expand in the future. But those stage boxes do tend to be more expensive than just getting the 32 channel mixer to begin with. But also you can use it for other things, like you can use that as your snake, which we'll talk more about later. So that's the first thing you'll look at. Second is digital versus analog. And I kind of pulled out the 3 things that I think are the biggest differences. First up, digital, you can save settings. So when you show up at rehearsal or you show up at a performance, all you do is turn the mixer on and everything loads back to where it was left off. If for some reason somebody messed with it, you can have that saved on a flash drive or on the mixer itself and reload whatever you had. So as a backup, which makes digital great. You don't have to worry about students accidentally messing with things and messing it up, because you can always reload what you had. Next is that digital can be adjusted remotely. So you've probably seen people with iPads or the computers walking around. That's because they're using a digital mixer and they're able to control that remotely doing that. So that's great if you want to be able to stand at the top of the stands and adjust it, or maybe your mixer is near your synth player and you want to adjust it, but you don't want to bother them while they're trying to play, things like that. A pro for analog is that they are going to be cheaper, since they're not a like really intense computer, right? So like the digital mixer there's a lot going on. For an equivalent analog mixer of like a 32 channel mixer, it can be like $1,800 cheaper. So if you're really tight on a budget, analog maybe is a better option, but it's just something you have to consider. Another thing you'll see is console versus rack mixers. So when I say console, I mean like a mixer that would show up on a desk and you have all the faders and everything, versus a rack would be a rack mountable unit, and it doesn't tend to have those faders as options. So we actually use a rack mount mixer, and I actually kind of like it. There are moments when I wish we had a console, but overall, it's a nice way to have a smaller footprint, especially if your group isn't as big. We're a smaller group, so it kind of works out for us. Consoles are more user-friendly. It's what you're used to seeing if you've ever run sound anywhere, right? So it has the faders, each channel you can see. So it's a little bit more user-friendly if you have people that aren't as techy. Rack mount mixers tend to be cheaper, not a ton, but a little bit. So for a 32 channel mixer, it's roughly $500 cheaper. So it's a little bit of a cost savings. And then the racks are smaller. So if you don't have a large group and you don't really want to spend money to have a mixer cart or something to carry around the mixer, the rack can easily slide into smaller boxes and you can transport it that way. So after you got your mixer picked, you probably want to look at microphones. So for microphones, you really have 2 types that you're going to want to consider for marching arts related activities, and that's dynamic or condenser microphones. The very short version is dynamic mics are more rugged. It's what we use just because honestly you can like hammer in a nail with them and they're still going to work later. So dynamic mics are a little bit more rugged, but a lot of groups will use condensers for their mount instruments because they're a little bit more detailed and that it's a little bit easier for them to pick up the signal as their students are playing. So it can make it a little bit higher quality. At the trade-off of they're a little bit more delicate and they require phantom power, but most of your mixers are going to have it. It's just something to put on there in case you ever come across, why isn't my microphone working? Well, it might be a condenser that needs phantom power. Some accessories to consider for your microphones are windscreens. I know that seems like a duh, but it's something that we didn't do until recently, and it really has made a big difference on wind noise across the microphone in the setup. So windscreens, if you get the SM57, which is like the most standard mic, they actually make a windscreen that you can screw into the mic, so you don't have to worry about it like falling off or students bumping it and losing it, so it can be attached to it. So just something to consider. Shock mounts, especially for your mallet instruments, because they are rolling, like doing cymbal rolls, those vibrations will actually run through the frame and can get picked up by the microphone. So investing in shock mounts is good to help reduce all of that low rumble noise. Mic clips, you obviously need that. And then however else you're planning on attaching it. And then the last thing would be, and this is a bigger category than what I plan on covering here, is wireless mics. You can dig into wireless mics for a long time. Wireless mics are great, but in general, if you can do it wired, I recommend doing it wired. So if your design has it where you're like getting to putting students on the field and trying to play solos and you really need to amplify, then yes, wireless mics are going to be great, and you're going to need to get those paddle antennas, and you're going to need to get RF frequency distributor and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot that's involved in that, and it's beyond kind of my knowledge base. So if you're going to do that, make sure you learn about that and explore. But in general, if you're going to use more than like one wireless mic, I would probably hire somebody to come in and set it all up for you rather than trying to do yourself, and have them explain it to you, because it's going to work out a lot better for you. So when we talk about speakers, there's really two components to speakers. There's the speaker itself, so like the cones where the sound comes out of, and the amplifier, which gets the signal as loud as it needs to be. So with speakers, there's two different kinds of speakers available. There's active speakers, and that's where the speaker that you think of, speaker proper, the cone, and the amplifier are in the same box. And then there's passive speakers where it's just the cone, the speaker, and the amplifier is somewhere else. It's a separate component. So when we talk about active speakers, that is the speaker and amplifier, so all the electronics are in one box, whereas passive, they're in separate boxes. So what this means for you when looking at speakers is active speakers are going to be more expensive and more expensive to replace, because everything's bundled into one box versus being two separate devices. So it's something, I know that can be kind of confusing, but again, active speakers, everything's in one box versus passive, they're separate. Because of this design where active speakers are all in the same box, the manufacturers design them to sound really good when you open the box. There's some individual tweaking that you might have to make to dial it in for your particular system or setup, but in general, they're going to sound pretty great coming out of the box. The downside to them is they do require two cables to work. They're going to require power, so you have to plug them into an outlet, and they require the audio cable. So it's just something to keep in mind, because it's an extra thing you have to do in your setup. They do make cables called like Siamese cables, where you can have those two cables connected, and then you have the individual ends that you plug in when you get to their terminal point. But it's still two things that you're having to plug in during the setup process. Conversely, passive speakers, the amp is separate, so it requires a separate amplifier to run, and that's a separate device that you would have to purchase. They are more modular, though, so it's easy to add on or upgrade, because you don't have to worry about replacing the amp necessarily. So if I buy cheap speakers now, cheap passive speakers, and then we have more funding later down the road, I can easily upgrade the speakers without having to upgrade the rest of my system, and it's going to be a little bit cheaper than going back and upgrading active speakers, because again, I'm not having to replace the amplifier in passive speakers. I do have to replace the amplifier in both speaker for active speakers. Passive speakers do require more design process, and what I mean by that is not only tuning them to get them to sound great, because they don't sound great necessarily out of the box because they're not matched with the amplifier you purchase necessarily, but also like making sure that the amp or the wattage and everything matches between the amplifier and the speaker. So there's a little bit more design process to that, and if you're really into going the passive route, I actually would recommend you hire somebody to help design the system. You're gonna get more bang for your buck. Even with active speakers, hiring somebody to design your system can be a good option, but particularly with that passive route, just to make sure everything works right. The benefit of them as well, though, is it is a one cable setup. You're just running your audio cable because they don't require power that's coming from the amplifier. On a short-term cost basis, they are going to be about the same. So if you get two equivalent systems, they're going to be roughly the same because your passive speakers are going to be cheaper, but you have to buy an amplifier, a third device. Your active speakers are going to be more expensive, but you don't need the amplifier. So short-term, they can be about equal, but long-term, your passive is going to allow you to upgrade and replace things at a cheaper cost. So for other gear that you may be looking at adding or replacing, we'll start with electronics, and I use that in air quotes to cover anything that creates sound digitally. So this could be sample pads, synthesizers, computers with MIDI controllers, whatever that may entail. Things to keep in mind is synthesizers, and when I say a synthesizer, I mean an instrument that's a keyboard that creates its own sound without being hooked up to a computer. They are going to, in general, depends on the synth, of course, but in general, they're going to be more limiting in your options. But they are a lot simpler. So you're able to just plug straight into the mixer without any extra devices, and you're good to go from there. Conversely, computers are going to be more complex because now you have the computer and a monitor, or if it's a laptop, then you have to make sure the battery's charged, and you need power to it, and you need an audio interface potentially, and you need a monitor so the student can hear, and you need, right? So there's this like continuous list of ands that add to the complexity, but you get more options by adding that complexity. So if you're somebody that's just doing halftime shows, then synthesizer may be totally fine. You're just looking for an electronic element to the show. If you're somebody that's doing lots of voiceovers and lots of sound effects and like a really rich sound design soundscape for your show, then you're going to need the computer to be able to do that extra complexity. So it's just things to consider when picking those electronics. If you pick a digital mixer, you're going to be interested in a wireless router, so you can take advantage of controlling it remotely. In general, with your wireless router, what you need is the strength of its signal. A lot of the times when you look at routers and it's advertised towards consumers and homeowners, there are going to be things that they talk about that you don't really care about because you don't need them. So things like a nice firewall and stuff like that. Because you're not connected to the internet, that doesn't really matter, right? So you care really about the signal strength to make sure that wherever you're on the field, you can connect to that wireless router, especially from the box. Or if there are people in the way or other things that are in the way, like a tent, that you can push the signal through, or if there's other routers in the area that are on that you can push your signal through. So just things to keep in mind. For power management, you have generators and like backup batteries. So for generators, you have kind of two different kinds, gas, and then they'll make like electric generators, which are really just giant batteries. For gas generator, you're going to have noise. They do make some that are pretty quiet, which are great to use. But again, keeping in mind that it's gas, so you may not be able to store it inside your school while it's filled. So where are you going to store this gas generator? If you're doing a indoor show and you need a generator for indoor drumline in the gym, you probably can't use a gas generator because of exhaust. So it's when you're thinking about what you're going to do, make the decisions around this. So if you're a group that does indoor drumline, it may be worthwhile to just invest in the battery one, even though you know you have to keep it charged and all of that. So just things to keep in mind and things to think through while picking things. If you have lots of electronics, you do want that backup battery just in case you do lose power to help protect the electronics. But also it allows you, before you're able to plug in or turn the generator on, you can go ahead and start powering up your devices and your computers and get them set up and ready to go. Things that are underrated in other gear, carts. Buy good carts. And when I say good carts, really I mean buy good wheels. What you don't want to have happen is your students have to push all the equipment on, and it takes a lot of effort to get everything on the field because the wheels are really tiny and they don't really push very well. Make sure you get carts with nice wheels. It's going to make a huge difference in your quality of life and your students' quality of life. Nice wheels on the carts. And then lastly, tarps. Every piece of equipment on the field needs a tarp. especially if it's an electronic. But like all of your front equipment, you really need to have tarps, and we attach them to the physical instrument. So each student has their own dedicated tarp, so that we don't have to worry about it. It's always attached every time we push in and out. It's always there, ready for them. But especially for the electronics, they are delicate. Please, please have tarps. Please have tarps. And bungee cords too, so that you can keep it tight. Ideally, get a tarp that's covers the whole device, but it's not so loose that rain could get in or wind could blow it off, is kind of your ideal. So that's a very quick rundown of a system build, just to give you an idea of what all your options are.